I was saying in our in years ago, I worked with a person in an office or in a work that we were doing together, a number of us, and a colleague, I guess you would say. And I learned a very good lesson. And the lesson was never recommend movies to other people, or at least if you're going to recommend movies to other people, be circumspect in what you say, because what happens is you might actually love a movie, but other people, they go see that movie on your recommendation and they come back and says, oh, it was terrible, that was the worst movie I've seen, or something or another to that effect. And I had this friend who was that way, and I learned never to recommend movies to her because she could not abide by any movie that was sad. And often, sometimes some of the very best movies have a certain element of sadness to them, or they have an element of tragedy to them. But if it was not a comedy or something that was very, very light, she would identify so much with those movies that she would, come away heavy, feeling that it would awaken so many bad thoughts in her mind, and she just could not stand anything that wasn't on a very light nature. So I had to be very careful what I said about a movie, and so I didn't. But in those years ago, and before COVID, of course, and when we could get together, I actually enjoyed more than movies. I really enjoyed going to the theater if when I had the opportunity to do that. I didn't have that opportunity so much when I was in India, but when I was in America, when I was younger, I used to like to go to the theater. And somehow I found the theater live production, in other words, of people acting and putting on plays. I found that a lot more immediate. And if it was done well, it was much more evocative than a movie. Of course, it has it's its own thing. Movies have their place, but theater also has its place. And theater has a very ancient tradition. It goes way back. I think people have far before, you might say, movies were invented to make theater much more accessible to people, built upon the tradition of theater. And thousands of years ago, we still read plays from way back in ancient times. And the Greeks had a very vibrant theater tradition. And they would put on comedies, which still is popular. And they would stage tragedies. Now, why would somebody go and see a tragedy? And then again, why would somebody go see a sad movie? Is like my friend didn't never want to see anything that was sad. Well, the idea in the Greek tradition, at least, the idea was there was this element or this experience which they called catharsis. Now, catharsis to them was if they were to see a tragedy reenacted. And of course, when you put it into play, into a theater production, you condense it, you highlight it, and you take liberties with real life experience to bring out certain elements. And so a Greek tragedy, and even in modern times, built on that tradition, a theatrical tragedy is built on this idea of dramatizing some, perhaps typically there's a situation where a person will have a noble person, perhaps a great person, but they'll have a character flaw of some sort. And eventually, of course, as the story plays itself out on stage, that character flaw is highlighted to the point where it brings about that person's destruction, and it shows the end result of that. And in the watching of that, and if it's done very well, the audience is brought into the passage of events, and the emotion of that reliving, you might say, this tragic situation, that emotion The idea was not to do that just to stir up emotions so that a person might wallow in those emotions. But the idea was is to bring those emotions into clarity and to purge or to purify oneself. You know, oftentimes and usually the person dies at the end as a result of the tragedy of that indulgence in that perhaps character flaw. And you think, well, gosh, why would somebody who's not appreciative, you might say, of theater production or tragedy, might say, why does a person want to do that? Why do you want to relive that? Well, the idea was in the Greek tradition, by dramatizing it and looking at it and reliving it, we cleanse ourselves of that through a good, because it's art. And through art, one can, and this is a high value of art, and one is through art, we can purge ourselves and purify ourselves. And so art was seen as a mechanism for purification. And now that's a very high, noble purpose. And I think sometimes art has lost that a little bit in our modern age, but it was considered spiritual in that sense because it was a way to relieve oneself of negativity of those things in its past. And I think we can apply that to our own lives now, because is not everybody to some degree tormented by memories, by we look back on our lives, and all of us have perhaps these little faults that we carry with us and we don't like them. And as we want to overcome them, how do we overcome them? Now, all of this is a prelude. I'm mentioning this because I received a letter a couple weeks ago, a while back. And this person had asked me, was asking in the letter, they were looking back on their life and they were haunted by memories. Has that ever happened to you? I mean, I have certain memories I look back and, you know, are cringeworthy. I go, oh, I did that. Oh my God, you know, and then I don't like to necessarily think of those memories again. But, you know, but some people are haunted in a, you know, in a very serious way. And this person was such a one. And she was haunted by memories from her childhood and had undergone a difficult childhood. A lot of things had happened. There's an abusive childhood, family issues, alcoholism, all sorts of things from her family upbringing. And she could not, and she felt herself formed or deformed in her upbringing by those, and that those memories and those things that had happened had made her a prisoner to some degree in her life, and she couldn't shake those things, and she was kept looking back on them and perhaps feeling victimized, and even a little bit worse than that, she was feeling personally guilty also. Well, maybe all of that, she was only a child, of course, while all this was happening in her life, and somehow he says, oh, maybe that was my karma. My particular karma had brought on all of those things to happen in other people's lives. And so she was feeling a sense of deep responsibility for all of those negative things that happened to her in the past. And so you can imagine how all of this might have affected her. And she couldn't shake them. And the question she asked me, well, of course, what should she do about them was one, it was implied in the question, but she was saying, what should I learn from this? I feel that it's something is being asked of me to learn. What should I learn from this? Now, it was tempting for me to, you know, interject myself there and say, well, you should learn this or you should learn that. But I didn't. I didn't do that. My answer was that it's not for me to tell you what you should learn from that. Really, I think my question would be to you, and I think I'm saying this to anyone and any of us who have memories of the past that might relate in this way to this person's question, what did you learn from that? It's not what should you have learned from it. That's for you to decide what should you learn, but what did you learn? And I have found, and that was the essence, and I expounded upon that a little bit. Look back, if you can't, if these things haunt you, ask yourself, what happened? What did I, and dispassionately, because in the same way that we watch a movie, our life goes by us. When we look at our life, we look back upon what happened. It's like Dhritarashtra in the Mahabharata, where it opens up and he says, Sanjaya, what did they on the battlefield of life? It's the same question in a sense. We're Dhritarashtra asking that question. It's the mind, in Dhritarashtra's case, the blind mind, asking intuition or intuitive introspection. What did they? And when you look back on something like that, if there's an implication, we look back on our memories, we look good and bad, we have detached ourselves a little bit from them. And I've noticed this, that when I've had times when I've looked back on something and I did something in the past, I say, oh, and it's still there, and I wonder about it and feel bad about it. I notice that if I step outside of myself, as in a theater play, as in a movie perhaps, there's a detachment, because sometimes you watch that play or you watch that movie, and if you watch it in the Greek perspective of how it was meant and why it was meant, you see that tragedy happening, that situation happening. And when you go out of the theater, you say, oh, I feel cleansed of that. That was such a good movie. And it was terrible things may have happened at the end of that movie, and they all die. Or if you ever seen Othello, at the end, Shakespeare play, he's consumed by jealousy, and everybody dies at the end of it. And you go, on one hand, you could say, oh man, that was heavy. But on the other hand, if you perhaps take it the way Shakespeare or any great playwright meant it, you see the fruits of jealousy and you learn something from it. And this is how it is with memories and those things in the past. We don't want to go back into memories just to relive them and wallow in them. Oh, it was terrible, terrible. I was a victim, and why did it happen, and get angry about this has happened, that person was at fault, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we do that. We just wallow and recreate the emotions of that, which don't go anywhere. That's not helpful. It's not helpful either to, I don't think necessarily, there's something happened and you say, I'm not going to go there, I don't want to do it, and you just push it under the rug. Now, it's not the memory you're pushing under the rug, it's the memory or the emotion that it stimulates. I don't want to feel that emotion, so I'm not even going to deal with it in any way. And you sometimes find yourself, and if you do that, becoming a prisoner of that. Because if anything like that starts to recreate itself in your life again, you react, perhaps either push it away or you don't react appropriately. The right use of memory, and to see note, is to, as Paramhansa Yogananda said, this life was made for our education and our entertainment. And so that Greek tragedy is like that. It's meant for our entertainment, and it's meant for particularly for our education. And so consequently, the right use of memory, if these things happened and you are unresolved, is to look at them, but not to attach to them, to detach from them. And this is my friend who couldn't watch a sad movie, could not do that. Because whenever she would see something, she would be so attached, involved in it emotionally, that she couldn't remove herself to see it in a sense of a larger perspective that would allow her to let it go. And think of it this way. Now, Patanjali said that we can't remember our past lives because we're too attached to this life. And then the commentary that Swami Kriyananda would make on that, maybe Master made it too. He says, well, you see, if we could remember our past lives, and we would be attached to those emotions, and we wouldn't be able to put them in the past. They'd start to consume us lifetime after lifetime of an accumulation of bad movies or sad movies would overwhelm us. And so we're forced to forget them. But we don't rid ourselves of what happened in the past. There are karma, those karmic tendencies. And if those karmic tendencies in the past were full of emotional attachment to them, then there's karma involved in them. But to be able to remove oneself in a detached way, and then you can see them in that detached way, we can then let them go. You might say we bring them up, but there's no feeling of like or dislike or sadness, and you just let them go in the light. And this, in a sense, is what the yogi does when they reach that point of freedom, that there's still that old karma from the past, but yet they're in a state of freedom that it doesn't affect them. And so it's said that the yogi, once you've attained that state of nirvikalpa samadhi, goes back in their meditation and recalls those lifetimes of the past. And you don't have to relive all of those lifetimes again, all of those emotions that are stored there again, but you can remember them because you're not identified with any of them anymore. And in that state of non-identity, you can recall them and you can dissolve them into the light. Now, that's something we can do a little bit in our own lives to the degree, and this is why you could say high art is there as a cultural tradition, to be able to see maybe not particular situations, but you can see tragedy played out, jealousy, anger. You see all of these things in the Greek tragedy. They all die at the end, but you see, in vicariously through other people's in theater tradition, the idea is, yes, that's not something I want to do. I want to learn my lesson vicariously so that I don't do it and that I learn that lesson. Now, a person might ask, well, if I have that attachment still, and that thing happened in the past, and perhaps I did something wrong or something happened, if my just being detached from it emotionally, is that going to relieve me of the karma of it? Well, no, not necessarily. That if something put into motion in the past, it's like the pendulum. The pendulum swings, and you've put that emotionally in the past into motion, you see. You put it into motion, and so it's still there, and it's coming back. We have to experience that karma again. So how do we relieve ourselves of it? Just by, you might say, giving it up. Well, that karmic situation may return to you, but think it's not going to affect you. It's just something that's in the karmic pattern of creation that's going to happen, but it doesn't have to happen to you in the sense of ego involvement. It's just something that passes by you, passes through you. Perhaps you can even think about it in that way. So I was thinking of this once. I remember when, as a child, or as a kid, teenager, there was, you know, there was, you know how on the playground people try to, they compete with one another and they insult you and try to make you feel bad, and you try to reciprocate in that. That's that sort of thing. And I learned the lesson from that, that when something that affects you as a child, when you grow up, somebody says the same thing to you that reciprocates years later, and you're not that person anymore. And it had absolutely no effect upon you. It had no effect upon me. Somebody trying to insult me or to, to criticize me for something, it had no impact on me because I wasn't that person anymore. I was now an adult, and it was silly. There was some silly thing in the past. It's kind of like that with karma. If you still have emotions about something, then you're susceptible. And that karma, you'll still, when it comes, it's going to come and stimulate those emotions. Well, when it comes back, if you've worked out those emotions already through your life experience, by learning the lesson, and primarily becoming detached, and you see it, it was just all a play. I'm not there anymore. That I from the past is no longer here. It's gone. There's no emotion about it at all. And it's just something, it was funny. You laugh about it. All of those crazy things that happened that at once upon a time would have affected me or affected you. Now it's nothing there. So yes, that rebuttal or the may come back, but there's nothing to it anymore. And it just passes on through because you've exited the scene. That old you could say, and the emotions that was there's exited the scene. Now, for us as devotees, and I think everybody, the human nature of looking back in our memory, we can't help but be to some degree affected by all of those old memories, but we mustn't let them make us prisoners. And the way to, and don't be afraid of the old memories. The cure is to learn to put ourselves, to change our consciousness to a more elevated state. And when we become a more elevated state, the old you begins to go away. And when those memories come, they don't mean anything. Now, we can do this consciously to some degree when we meditate and when we practice our Kriya. I know if there's particular ideas or thoughts or memories that come back to you, put them aside. Now, I'm not saying sweep them under the rug and try to forcibly, but just put them aside. We do our Kriya, and if you can, through the practice of your Kriya, induce a state of joy within yourself, or deep peace, or a deep sense of calmness. And sometimes, if in that state, you then recall a memory and you hold that memory, it's not the memory of the incidents themselves, but it's more the emotion or the feeling that memory induces in you. And you can hold that memory up into the light and let it dissolve, let that light dissolve, or that feeling of joyfulness that you feel, and look at it through that lens, experience that memory through that lens of joy. You'll find that it begins to dissolve. And the way it dissolves, it's not that the memory is forgotten. The incident itself, you might, or say the acts that happen, but it's like a play. You now have removed yourself emotionally from it, and you just see it playing out. And ideally, you learn the lesson. And see, we don't have to repeat emotionally everything to work it out. If we can detach to be able to see it and not be attached to it. When we reach that point of detachment, it's all, like Master used to say, light, the play of light and shadow on the screen of duality. and you just enjoy the movie. And then you can see any movie and enjoy it. And you enjoy it. Perhaps you have a sense of catharsis for it. And you don't have to, be, oh, I don't want to look at that movie because it brings up too many bad memories. And unfortunately, memories, we don't get rid of them, or the emotions that the karma that was stimulated by those things. And I'm not saying we should bring them up to wallow in them, because if you bring them up and are not able to deal with them, they do, you might say, capture us. And we don't want to be, but yet to some degree, until we can relieve ourselves of the past, we become prisoners of the past. And we don't want to be that easy, that either. And the spiritual path is one of learning the past is done. That's not me. Don't identify with it. And then change your consciousness to allow you to not identify with it, because it's not enough to just tell yourself don't identify with it. We have to also then do that, grow, mature, develop, change our consciousness to the point where we are not prisoner of it. And that comes from changing our consciousness. And Kriya, yoga, meditation, these are one of the very best ways to be able to do that. And eventually we look at it and life becomes entertainment, you might say. At some time, I'm going to say it becomes a comedy rather than a tragedy. But whatever it might be, it certainly, we begin to see it as a great play of light and shadow, and it all happened. Oh, that happened to be me, and I was the actor in that play, at that time. But wasn't that wonderful? And wasn't it something that I learned a great lesson from that? And so try to do that to the degree that, because this one person I told that to, pass that information on to her, and said, try this. Just see if you can ask yourself this question. Not what should I have learned? What did I learn from that experience? We mess up all the time. What did I learn? Thank you, God. Let me learn something from that. And just taking that attitude of alone, asking yourself, what did I learn? And sincerely trying to understand, detaches yourself from it to a certain degree. And it's a first good step to see this life as a school. Learning the lessons allows us to graduate. And when the opportunity or when the karma comes back again, we aren't affected by it. We can slough it off, and we don't continue that karma again. As long as there's emotion there, we're going to keep that pendulum moving. But we say, I've learned that lesson, and you change the way that you respond when and if that karma returns again. And so let's try that and see if that makes some difference. Learn our lessons and be perhaps even entertained in the process. Much joy to all of you. See you next week. Om Guru.